What would be the, how would you describe the main features of functionalist anthropological studies?
Well, it grew up out of Malinowski's studies of the island of Kirowina in the Trobriand Islands in Melanesia, which he studied between 1914 and 1918. And in first case, the study of Tikopia, which is a small Polynesian island of 3 square miles in size and 1,200 people. And they tended to take for granted that the community they were studying had clear-cut geographical boundaries, and that also boundaries of a social kind in time and space, as it were. So that you studied this society as you observed it over a period of 1 year, 2 years, or as long as you could, but sort of photographically, as it were, an instantaneous holding picture of the society. And you didn't worry too much about how it had come to be like that. You didn't worry at all. You rather tended to imagine that it had always been like that. And you didn't worry too much about its contacts with other parts of the world. You were concerned with the micro-sociology, you might say, of how the institutions which you observed directly fitted together like the gear wheels of a watch. Radcliffe Brown was also a functionalist, when a contemporary of Malinowski's, had a very peripatetic career, but came back to Oxford in 1936. And he was a devoted follower of Émile Durkheim, the French sociologist, though he took a rather narrow view of what Durkheimian sociology was about. And to some extent, he was interested in the comparison of societies as types. He was interested rather in the manner of Max Weber, the German sociologist, that he thought of societies as corresponding to certain ideal types, which could then be set up on a kind of taxonomy, and eventually you would have a scientific sociology in which types of societies were like the types of mammals and types of insects and so on. And it was a really botanical way of thinking about it. And but here again, he was concerned with how institutions fit together to make a system, an articulated system, rather like the skeleton of a mammal. But I was never directly associated with Radcliffe Brown, except that he was my examiner of my PhD thesis, which I owe him thanks. And I knew him personally, but I never had contact with him academically.
Would this be because of your mechanistic bent you were rather opposed to this biological approach?
Well, it is principally because a rivalry had grown up between Oxford anthropologists under Radcliffe Brown and London anthropologists under Firth. But I dare say this is true, that my model making was much more mechanistic and abstract, whereas Radcliffe Brown, who fancied himself rather as a mathematician, but didn't seem to need to know any mathematics, did use his models, biological models, to a degree which I found was rather naive. But of course, there was later Evans Pritchard, who had been succeeded Radcliffe Brown at Oxford, and had originally been very close to Radcliffe Brown, later deviated from his position very widely by reinstating an interest in history and in ideology, as opposed to, and in some ways moved rather closer to Levi-Strauss.
I wanted to ask you about Levi-Strauss. I mean, it's obvious to us that your formal training has been in the English functionalist school. Why did Levi-Strauss have such importance for you?
Well, it's a bit of a long story, but it's like this. Levi-Strauss' background, anthropological background, was really taken up from the American cultural anthropologists, or ethnologists as the English would call them, particularly Lowy. And in 1940, the end of the war, he was in New York and became closely associated with the famous linguist Johan Jakobson, and clearly picked up a great many ideas from Jakobson and wanted to apply Jakobson's ideas to the kind of comparative cultural anthropology which he had learned from the Americans. His major application of this was in this book which was published in 1949 originally on the elementary structures of kinship in the first French edition, which is a comparative study of kinship systems, essentially kinship terminologies father, brother, son, cousin and so on, over a geographical area stretching from Australia to Siberia. And Lévi-Strauss tried to show that by comparing the kinship terminologies and the formal rules of marriage over this large geographical area, he could arrive at certain fundamental principles about exchange systems as reflected in marriage. You could have types of exchange where the marriage was reciprocal, the two sides exchanged brides, or you could have them asymmetrical where one side gave a bride and the other side did not. Now, this is far removed from British functionalist social anthropology. However, the central axis point, the sort of focal point of Lévi-Strauss's massive volume was the chapter relating to the Kachins of North Burma, which was based, of course, on rather antique ethnographic fact before I'd ever got there, and was in many cases, many details wrong. I mean, the ethnography was wrong. But this was the central chapter of the book about which the thing really hung. And I was fascinated because these were the people I'd worked with throughout the war. I really knew about my Kachins. And what baffled me was that although Lévi-Strauss's ethnographic facts, a simple recording of custom, was in many cases quite wrong, nevertheless his method had arrived at certain insights about the underlying principles of which the sister society worked, which no one previous to him had perceived. And indeed, I'm not sure how far I'd perceived it. At the moment he said this, it was quite obvious that he got it back to front, upside down. Like nevertheless, this doesn't matter very much. I mean, he'd understood something about the society which no one else had understood. And this fascinated me, how it could come to be that someone could be wrong on his facts, but right somehow about the theory. Because he's coming at it as he's trying to apply a theory of linguistics to the facts.
That's what I want to ask you. How does that work?
Well, of course, Jakobson, the key thing for Jakobson's linguistics, which comes from de Saussure, much earlier in the century, but in Jakobson's case, it is concerned with phonology. How do we actually pick up a message from a flow of speech? A flow of speech is, at an objective level, is a pattern of sound on the breath, imposed on the breath. And this pattern, when you write it down, consists of vowels and consonants and accents and intonations and so on, alternating with one another. And yet we are not only capable of grafting this coded message onto our breath, but we are able to decode it again and turn it into a meaningful message. And Jakobson is interested, first of all, how do we do this? It's inconceivable in view of the vast variety of human languages that there are, that our mental apparatus can be so sophisticated that it can, as it were, decode anything if they were all different, there must be some very fundamental principles which it operates on. And Jacobson talks about distinctive features. In Levi-Strauss's argument, binary oppositions, the very small number of oppositions which we can recognize. We can't recognize them consciously, we recognize them unconsciously. We recognize unconsciously the difference between the hard sound P and the soft sound B, and so that pit is not the same as bit. But I mean, that's all, it's just a single alternation, a very, very fine grade, and the whole of phonology, according to Jacobson and friends, is built up on a very limited number of distinctive features which can decode the whole system. And so Levi-Strauss, but this is in the mind. Yes. It is not out there. It is something in the mind. And Levi-Strauss is arguing that when customary behaviors must similarly be coded in this sort of way, so that when we act in a certain customary way, we are possibly not acting in some, in as it were, the opposite way, whatever the opposite way is. And that this, again, conveys a message which is in the mind. Now, this is very tricky. What do we mean by in the mind? I mean, the whole functionalist tradition has been very much empirical, observing what people do out there, recording the fact, everything that the functionalist does, as it were, is something which you can record on a tape recorder, take a photograph of, make a videotape of, and so on. They're highly suspicious of interpretative notions in the mind. And therefore, this is where my puzzles have been. What is the relationship between these objective facts out there in the world, which are, as it were, in a sense really objective, in the sense that you can actually record them and preserve them on tape recorder, and the message buried, the argument that these behaviors, besides doing things, I mean, you do things in the sense that you grow potatoes and you build a house and you actually alter the state of the world, but also they say something. So there is a whole coding involved in the way the food we eat, the dresses we wear, the kind of houses we live in, the way we arrange our houses. I mean, you don't just go into a house and find all the rooms are the same. I mean, there's a living room, and there's a kitchen, and there's a privy, and there's a bedroom, and these have all very different values, and there's a sort of coding pattern built into that. And the way buildings are arranged on the ground. I mean, that pigsties are not like human houses. But if we want to be contemptuous of a human being, we say you live in a pigsty and so on. You know? And there's so much in the ordinary material things we do, which the functionalists have paid so much, which is in fact concerned with giving messages rather than with just solving economic problems. And it is this big change, I think, that nowadays no one can entirely ignore. I mean, very much in the Malinowski tradition, it was how does the behaviors, the customary behaviors, how do they serve the needs of the individual, and what was meant was how do they keep him alive? I mean, the basic need for the human being is to keep warm, eat food, procreate his species, and not die. And you then showed that the whole of your cultural arrangements of the Trobriand Islands just did this. Well, in a way, it's fairly obvious, because if they didn't do that, there wouldn't be any Trobriand Islanders to talk about. But having shown this, and you showed a number of interesting things which previously people hadn't noticed, of how things dovetail in together, what they tended to overlook was that all these behaviors are also saying things, communicating messages, and it is the nature of the message, how the coding how the messages are coded, which underlies how the sort of structuralist element has got worked into the system. And I think most practicing anthropologists now, there has been a tremendous merging of these two schools, in that most field anthropologists, whether they're American or French or English, now do very much the same sort of thing. And what they do is obviously derived from Malinowski. It has more gadgets. It has, you know, television cameras and tape recorders and all sorts of other things. But nevertheless, what they're doing is what Malinowski would have said his field workers ought to do. But now they go into the field assuming that part of their job is to try and understand the symbolic coding of what is built into the behavior, as well as just the materialist economic coding.
Now, having got to that level, with your kind of thing, and also in a measure with Levi-Strauss's kind of thing, but there's a very big difference between what interests you, or what you're trying to do, and what he's trying to do, as I understand it. Could you tell us what that difference is? You're not wholeheartedly a disciple.
No, well, this is, of course, always very difficult. He seems to think that, and here I'm not sure that he would actually agree with what I say, but what he seems to be thinking, he talks about the human mind, and he seems to be looking for features of social systems which arise direct from the fact that it is human beings who participate them, and any sort of human beings would do equally well. And it must be so when he is able to fit together, take the whole mythology of the Americas, and actually says in one way, this myth, which was recorded in the Amazon, only becomes comprehensible when it is put side by side with this other myth, which was recorded in Alaska or somewhere up there. And now this must be that there is something universal about the mental operations of the human beings who created these two stories. There couldn't be any other. And he's able to make this comparison, quite taking no notice of the fact that one myth was generated in the tropics in the Amazon, and the other in the semi-Arctic or something. Now, I'm very, very skeptical about this sort of thing. I feel that that there are certain very basic principles about how these coding systems operate, but they're so basic that they don't get you very. I mean, they're as basic as the way computers work. I mean that the flip-flop mechanism of computers and continuity, discontinuity. At that level, yes, there are universals about how we think, how we operate. But I would be very, very cagey about sort of just jumping about around the map and saying, oh, well, you know, that reminds me of that.